When it comes to holiday gift giving, I want to give things people really love. Beautiful, timeless pieces they'll wear for years. That's why I'm going with Quince. From Mongolian cashmere sweaters to Italian wool coats, Quince offers premium quality at a price that works for my holiday gift-giving budget. The only problem I'm having is deciding between Quince's beautiful home goods, jewelry, accessories, bags, and clothing. There are so many options, you'll definitely find something for everyone on your list. Oh, and I should mention their adorable kids and baby clothes and their holiday PJs, which will look great in your holiday photos. Every piece is made with premium materials from ethical, trusted factories and priced far below what other luxury brands charge. Find gifts so good you'll want to keep them with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada, too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Before we get started, just a quick warning that this episode discusses sexual assault, so please take care while listening.
Affirmative consent or enthusiastic consent, so being very positively affirmative about wanting to do something instead of being reluctant or hesitant to. Switching to a narrative about a clear yes and also seeking a yes. So a lot of criminal systems around the world, I guess, have a flip of that around consent where you have to prove that you said no in a case of sexual assault. Whereas affirmative consent or enthusiastic consent means ensuring that you actively seek to yes instead of just allowing silence.
That was Chanel Contos on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Mac Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host's discussion of today's interview.
Hey everybody, it's Jill here, and I'm so excited to introduce my guest to you today. We are going to be talking about a topic we've never talked about on POTC before, which is consent. My guest is Chanel Contos. Chanel Contos is an international award-winning activist who founded Teach Us Consent, a campaign that mandated consent education in Australia and criminalized stealthing in multiple states. Chanel has a master's in education, gender, and international development from University College London and is currently obtaining a master in public policy from Oxford University. In 2022, Chanel was named by the BBC as one of 100 inspiring and influential women worldwide. Her work has been platformed globally with coverage from BBC, The New York Times, France 24, and many other outlets. We are here today to talk about her book, Consent Laid Bare: Sex, Entitlement, and the Distortion of Desire. Chanel, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege.
So you and all the brave humans who shared their stories with you are the reason that consent education was mandated into the Australian school curriculum. That is incredible. So can you start by sharing a little bit of your story and how Teach Us Consent was born?
Yeah, it's quite serendipitous how it all happened, but there's a few reasons that led me to a point where I felt compelled to talk about this topic on the internet. The first being that when I received consent education myself, when I was young, when I was about 15 years old and my peers were 16, I was young for the year. It was such a absolute life-changing talk for us to have consent defined to us and to understand that it was required in order for a sexual situation to not be one of assault. And it really reframed a lot of our early sexual experiences for us. And I think it was an extraordinarily overwhelming experience to have those things redefined, but also extremely validating. And I mean, I would say it's a unique experience, but it's not, because when I give consent talks, I see the girls in front of me kind of go through the exact same motions of delayed realizations and anger and validation, all those things. So yeah, it was receiving consent education that was so impactful for me, that made me really care about it. And then also, I guess, growing older and looking back on this time and seeing the injustice a bit more, and then also seeing the complete lack of accountability for the perpetrators of a lot of these crimes.
Yeah.
And, you know, it being 5-10 years old and seeing them working as bankers, as lawyers, as football stars, whatever they're doing, and just the frustration that came from that, and conversations with friends about how those early sexual experiences that were void of consent were so defining to us, as not just in the moment, because I actually think less so they were defining as like one-off instances, but more so how they positioned us in the gender hierarchy and how we saw ourselves and how we navigated our sexualities from that point onwards, starting from a baseline of your autonomy doesn't matter and your pleasure doesn't matter, and what that kind of meant for us as we were going into early adulthood. So anyway, all of that to say, eventually, when I was in my early 20s, I decided to post on Instagram saying, have you or has anyone close to you ever been sexually assaulted by someone who went to an all-boys school? And it was originally in Sydney, but then I started getting these testimonies and responses from all over Australia. So that's when I started the petition to mandate consent education in the Australian national curriculum, because Australia does actually have one comprehensive curriculum. It is not very detailed because the states work off it and then independent schools work off it again. But there is a minimum curriculum that, doesn't have much in it. And now it has consent in it, which is really incredible, and so thankful for the 50,000 Australians who supported that mission.
Yes, I wish that we would do the same in the US. It is really such a cool and incredibly important movement. So I think before we move on, we probably need to define consent, which I know people ask you this all the time, and there's a lot in the book about it. But how would you define consent or lack of consent, if it's easier to do it that way? Or like you also talk about affirmative or enthusiastic consent. So can you kind of orient us to those?
For sure. So I guess consent, I have a chapter about this in the book, about how it's like in some ways the most simple thing ever, but in other ways quite difficult to actually define, because when you're talking about the idea of permission to do something, that gets really murky when this word permission can be so loaded with expectations and societal pressures and individual pressures between two people. So affirmative consent or enthusiastic consent, so being very positively affirmative about wanting to do something instead of being reluctant or hesitant to.
Like it's not just the lack of no.
Exactly.
Right? It's like an enthusiastic, clear yes.
Switching to a narrative about a clear yes and also seeking a yes. So a lot of criminal systems around the world, I guess, have a flip of that around consent, where you have to prove that you said no in a case of sexual assault. Whereas affirmative consent or enthusiastic consent means ensuring that you've actively seeked a yes instead of just allowing silence or whatever it may be, or hesitancy consent, because I think a lot of people sometimes say things when they're scared. They agree to do things when they're scared that they don't really want to do, or they say things to diffuse a situation or de-escalate a situation, and that can often be misunderstood as a form of consent, particularly by someone who maybe doesn't have very high levels of empathy towards that person.
Right. Or even you talk a lot in the book about the process of wearing someone down. Like a woman says no 7 times and then finally just gives in. And it's like, oh, fine, because it's like sick of fighting. And like, that's not affirmative consent.
No, it's not. And I think when you said as well, like, can we define what not consent looks like? Which is, unfortunately, probably easier to do. But sexual coercion was such a game-changing term for me to understand and learn about. And that is being pressured forced, threatened, or tricked in a non-physical way. So it's essentially sexual assault that occurs with words. And when you realize that the vast majority of sexual violence occurs that way, it really breaks down a lot of the stereotypes you have in your head about what type of people are able to perpetrate sexual violence. And I think that, persistent, that wearing down until you get a yes, or, the kind of guilt that could come along with it. Or I see a lot in young people and teens, it's blackmail, really. It's, if you don't do this, then I'm going to send that photo that you sent me last week to your parents, or I'm going to send it to your friends or to the whole year group. And when you realize that sentences like that can be the catalyst for a sexual assault, I think it really reframes the topic in whole.
Well, let's talk about the different categories of rape, because you just mentioned when you realize most sexual assaults happen in these kinds of ways. So you put rape into 4 categories. It's sadistic rapists, angry rapists, compensatory rapists, and entitled opportunist rapists. So the first 3 are what are portrayed in the media and what we think of when we think about rape. But the latter are actually the entitled opportunist rapes. Those are the ones that are the most common and the least likely to face consequences. So can you talk a little bit about this and like why this distinction matters?
Yes, that was such a great summary. So this research about different types of rapists sat with forensic psychiatric research. And I came across it when I was doing my first thesis dissertation and found it so interesting and was like, this needs to be brought into the sphere of gender equality, and this needs to be brought into the sphere of violence prevention, because how are we going to prevent violence if we don't truly understand our perpetrators? And entitled opportunist is the term I've coined, but they're called opportunistic rapists in literature. And they're people who don't plan their attacks, and they take opportunities as they arise for the purpose of fulfilling their immediate desire for sexual gratification, which is why I think entitlement is so key to understanding this type of rapist and that perpetration. And most of these types of rapists start when they're teenagers, because by their inherently, entitled perception of what sex should be and what it is, and often their low respect towards women, speaking in, heteronormative framework here, their default action is to be coercive and is to have their pleasure centered, which is why it's so easy for them to slip into an act of sexual assault. And what was so interesting about this was these rapists make up the majority of rapists in prison. But if we think about how our criminal system works and how hard it is to get a he said, she said situation into a conviction, we can imagine that it's an overwhelming amount of the problem is this type of person, this type of perpetrator. And they were really easy to prevent reoffense. It was really hard to prevent reoffense for the first 3 types of rapists, because intergenerational trauma and, very disordered desires come into play in their perpetration. Whereas an entitled opportunist is, for lack of better words, they're simply horny. And they want that gratification, and they'll take it from anyone without caring too much about them.
You explain it how it's like when empathy is low and entitlement is high. And this is the category that date rapists fall into. And I was even thinking of like the Harvey Weinsteins and the Bill Cosbys and the Donald Trumps, like most of the people that we hear about in the media that we know that are famous, that are part of the Me Too movement, are entitled opportunist rapists. And so when I say like the first 3 categories are what we see in the media, I mean more TV shows. Like, if you're watching Law and Order SVU, it's a guy sneaking in your window with a knife or a gun who gets their sadistic and power needs met by rape, when in reality, it's often more this, typically a male whose entitlement outweighs their empathy, and they just take what they want and what they think they need in the moment and don't think at all about how it's going to impact the person that they're assaulting.
Exactly. And they're often, very sociable, come across as nice people in all other aspects of life. They're often quite successful in their careers as well, because they don't take no for an answer. And we have a society that rewards that in men in the same way that that can be such a damaging trait in an intimate moment. And I think as well, understanding, it sounds maybe a bit dramatic to say, but the way that my organization teaches consent does a lot of the work we do is we kind of see anyone to have the potential to be an entitled opportunist, particularly with young people learning how to have sex from watching pornography, which is often, very explicit scenes that are completely dismissing female pleasure. If anything, skewed the other way, often showing violence against women and women in responding to that extremely submissively. If they're like learning this from that, honestly, it's character type that anyone could slip into quite quickly if that entitlement's too high. So sexual violence occurs because entitlement to another outweighs the empathy that you feel towards that person. So a lot of the whole theory of change around the book and the work I do is how do we increase empathy in young people, particularly young boys, towards other women.
Yeah. And not just the perpetrators. Like I just flashed thinking about Brock Turner, the Stanford student who raped Chanel Miller.
Yeah.
And, if you remember that court case, the father was the one who was saying something to the effect of like how 30 seconds of a bad decision shouldn't ruin this promising young man's career. And then the judge that bought into it too, right? So it's not just the perpetrators like Brock Turner, it's his father, it's the judge, it's so many people in the legal system that all buy into this, sense of entitlement for a promising young man and lack of empathy to their victims.
I think it also raises a really good question here. I want to be very cautious to not sound like I am sympathizing with Brock Turner or his father, but when you learn about an entitled opportunist and when you think about the criminal system and the prison system as being a method to remove individuals from society for the protection of greater society, you can understand why there's so much cognitive dissonance between an entitled opportunist perpetrator and the concept of them going to jail, because they are fundamental members of our society. They are embedded in our society. We celebrate them in our society. And we think, again, if the whole idea is preventing reoffense, then that course of action may not feel necessary. In that same breath, the consequences that it can have on their victim are so dire. And the fact that it's either 0 or 100, I think is also why there is so little accountability in this topic, because even the criminal system beyond reasonable doubt is such an important pillar, and innocent until proven guilty is so important in the way that our whole system functions. But it doesn't work with rape. It doesn't work with gender-based violence. Yes,
unless we all start wearing body cams every minute of every day.
Yeah.
It's always going to be he said, she said.
Exactly. And then even to that level, it's like, well, what level of justice is enough if you've impacted someone's life to this extent? So I do think that it calls for a full reimagination of what accountability should look like. And I think that's something that we need to go towards over the next, I don't know, it will probably take many years, if not decades.
Yeah.
But just pointing out that like the system's not working because it doesn't work for either the perpetrator or the victim.
It's the holiday season, and in addition to the higher expenses that come this time of year, we also now have 2 kids who need braces, and it's already time to be registering for summer camps. Thankfully, we now use Monarch to keep on top of our expenses so we don't end up surprised or stressed out when it comes to our finances. If you want to keep your finances under control this holiday season, you need to be using Monarch. Rated Wall Street Journal's best budgeting app of 2025, Monarch is the all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean interface on your laptop or your phone. And right now, just for our listeners, Monarch is offering 50% off your first year. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK.
I love learning. It's one of my favorite activities. And if you'd asked me what I would bring to a desert island, I would say, well, masterclass. Right now, I'm geeking out with the other co-hosts about their classes on writing. My personal favorite is Dan Brown's class on writing a thriller. I've read all his books. With Masterclass, you get thousands of bite-sized lessons across 13 categories that can fit into even the busiest of schedules. You can do what I do and turn your commute or workout into a classroom. With audio mode, you can listen to Masterclass lessons anytime, anywhere, just like you do with this podcast. And if you're headed on a trip, you can download classes to watch offline and make the most of your travel time. It even works if you're headed to a desert island. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/POTC for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/POTC. masterclass.com/POTC.
This also makes me think about the broader concept of just rape culture. And you tell a story in the book that you were with this group of male friends and you made the comment, it's socially acceptable to rape. And of course, all the men in this, I think you were like sitting around a campfire or something, all thought this was absolutely nuts. Like, of course, it's not socially acceptable to rape. So explain that, like what you meant when you had that conversation with them.
Well, what I meant by that conversation was that, this group of boys who are all very lovely, who, were my dear friends through uni and still are my close friends, all socialize with men who have raped women, and whether they know it or not, some of them they've heard rumors, some of them it was 10 years ago, so they don't really care, but they still play footy with them. Maybe they're not best friends with them, but they see them at parties, they say hi. It's completely socially acceptable for these people to have done these things and for them to have gotten away with it. And that was very satisfying to then, rattle off probably tens of different names of mutual friends that had committed these sorts of things. And what I'm describing by that and what is rape culture is a sociological setting where sexual assault and rape becomes pervasive and normalized because of our societal expectations and attitudes towards gender and sexuality. And what's really key in that is the idea of normalization.
Yeah.
And acts of rape become commonplace because we have so many constant smaller violations of consent or of disrespect towards women. And then suddenly the concept of something that is objectively a sexual assault very quickly becomes, oh, he was drunk and she was really drunk and they went home and he did that to her. But that's just classic him, because that's his vibe and he's crazy and he gets crazy on nights out, but he's really hot, so she probably would have done it anyway and whatever. And then suddenly rape's socially acceptable.
Yeah.
And
boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys. And
Yeah.
I actually think, again, talking about how the criminal system has been such a failure in so many ways, I think we do need to turn to social consequences as a solution, because I think they can be so much more impactful and potentially feel like a more just punishment for a lot of these crimes that I want to emphasize largely happen in teenage years, where the perpetrator and the victim are both children. And I personally am very against the criminal system for children. So if we're even just looking at that, like those stats, that the majority of this is happening while both parties are children, it means we need to completely reimagine what accountability is looking like in these spaces.
And when you talk about social consequences, I'm thinking about some of the celebrities, like Louis C.K., and where like they maybe got quote unquote canceled for like a hot second. And now they're back. They're back on stage and making money. And like in a lot of ways, it really has not impacted them much at all. And I'm listening to the book Shrill. It's an older book at this point, but by Lindy West. And she talks a lot about these kinds of issues. And she debated a comedian, Jim Norris, about whether comedians should be flippantly talking about rape and sexual assault as part of their act. And, of course, most of the comedians say they should be able to talk about it in free speech, and they have all the reasons, and they claim that joking about it doesn't actually impact culture or behavior, right? But like after she went on TV and debated him, she got thousands and thousands and thousands of, comments, messages, et cetera, on the internet saying, you're so fat and ugly, no one would want to rape you. And wouldn't it have been awesome if Jim just raped Lindy? Like every single comment was men talking about how no one would want to rape her, or they wished that she would get raped. It's like, well, okay, clearly people talking about this stuff does actually incite this kind of sexual violence. And of course, they're just trolls on the internet and there are no social consequences. There are no consequences at all.
No, and I think it definitely is a foundational layer in, again, the normalization of real life acts.
It's rape culture.
If we're laughing about the concept of them or the idea of it, or if it's, when rape threats become commonplace, which is actually increasingly something that like I become worried about with the work I do. It's how common misogyny is to see on the internet, and the way it can reinstates that gendered hierarchy of your place in the world. And there's like lots of interesting research around young women saying like, yeah, we know we're going to get, abused for being online, but if we want to be online, that's what we have to do. And
it's so gross.
It's so gross. I think there's actually a sentence in my book that says something like, having a baby is more damaging to a woman's career than a man being accused of sexual assault.
Yes, it is. I came across that and was like, oh my gosh, that's true. Like, when you see all of this kind of discourse around rape and sexual assault, there's always the men who pipe up, not all men, but not all men. So, and you talk about this in your book. So talk about this sentiment and why this language is problematic. And you even use this blueberry metaphor that I thought was brilliant. Do you remember that? Can you share that?
Yeah, the cover of the book's a blueberry because of that.
I just made that connection. I didn't realize that. Oh my gosh, that's so funny.
It's very subtle, but I did think it was important. Basically, if you had a pot of blueberries and one's poisonous, would you eat any? And, it's the statistics do not say one in every punnet is poisonous. It says one in a lot more are. But I also think what's really important is not all men perpetrate sexual violence, but all men benefit off the fact that some men perpetrate sexual violence because they're benefiting from that social hierarchy that places them on top, that keeps all women in a constant state of minor fear and minor alert around men. It means that we're not sure how a men will act if we reject them. We don't know which blueberry they are, which means we have to cater to their egos, which means we might not reject them. We might say yes, because previous experience has taught us that if we say no here, it could escalate a lot worse. It could be a lot more violent. So I may as well just go with it, give in, whatever that is. I have a very lovely boyfriend, and I always try to remind him that every time someone's like, oh my God, he's so lovely, I'm like, it is the bare minimum, because it means that good men get celebrated and put on a pedestal for treating women with basic human decency, when it should be the absolute bare minimum and when it should be just commonplace. Why do they get clapped and celebrated for doing something that women do and treat each other and treat others with respect day in, day out, all the time? So it puts the bar on the floor, and it means that the men who, are above that bar get zoomed up to the top of the metaphorical bar.
Right. Yes. And there's still so much work to do, and we could use help from the quote unquote good men in doing that work.
Also, I mean, even that, sometimes it's so bad. I get annoyed when a man speaking about gender equality, or they get so highly celebrated, which is really good and we should do. And I agree, but I really wish that women received that same sort of accolade when they did something. I saw it a lot with a lot of student leaders and young people when the teachers' consent movement was really starting off, and a lot of young people around Australia were doing their own grassroots movements, speeches, walkout, and things like that. The girls were obviously being amazing, incredible, and speaking to all these things. And then the few boys who said something kind of were the ones who got 60-minute shows about them or documentaries and all this stuff. And it's
of course.
Yeah. And it's when we, again, it's the standard of just standing up for human rights gets you so highly celebrated.
Right. Or think back to the Bill Cosby thing, when so many people knew he was assaulting women and nothing was done. And then Hannibal Buress came out and started talking about it. And then all of a sudden, because Hannibal Buress had something to say about it, everyone started paying attention. But nobody was listening to any of the women prior to him coming out and talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah,
right? It's another example of that.
Such a hard line to toe in activism, because it's we need you on side and we love you and we love the good men, but also let's not praise you too much for just being normal men.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk a little bit about language. So you found that many women who were assaulted by entitled opportunist rapists had a really hard time using the word rape.
Mm-hmm.
So talk about this and what you think is important for us to know or to do when it comes to language around consent, assault, rape.
Yeah, so most people, and specifically women who are subjected to violence by an entitled opportunist, where, again, it doesn't fit the stereotypical understanding of what we listen to in true crime podcasts or what we see on Netflix documentaries or whatever that is, when it's more sexual coercion than physical force or very minor physical force, these victim survivors tend to not identify as a victim survivor, and they also tend to not use the word rape to describe their actions. So if you ask a group of young girls, have you ever been pressured into sex? Have you ever been too drunk to be able to consent to sex? Have you ever been asleep and someone started having sex with you? If you use words like pressured or pushed into or things like that, they will say yes. They will respond yes at very high rates. Whereas if you just ask, have you been raped? They won't respond to those same questions the same. Even though when asked to describe what this pressuring felt like, it does encapsulate all things that are objectively acts of sexual assault. And I think that what's really interesting about that is a few things. I think what we can learn from that is that a lot of people feel that they're being dramatic to define an act as one of rape, because again, we have this stereotypical view of what it means, and we have a somewhat unhelpful narrative that being subjected to rape is something that will define your life and your experience forever. And for some people, it might and it may, but for a lot of people, it doesn't. And I think that not fitting into that can be really confusing for people. And I think it also speaks to the socialization of women and the way that we are kind of conditioned to downplay things that happen to us and move on and be resilient or whatever that is. And the fact we don't want to draw too much attention to this and we don't want to put it in that category, or we don't want to sound like we're being dramatic or attention seeking, because again, there's so many narratives around victims only talking about this for attention and you know, that whole package as well. So I feel like there's so much in that, but what I think is most important to take away from it is that it is really important to define these things that are sexual coercion as acts of assault or rape, to give people the autonomy to talk about it. And in that same vein, it's also really important that when we are having conversations, particularly with wider groups of people, that we're thinking of the fact that people may not want to think of themselves as a victim survivor of a situation, and they just want to think of what accountability could look like or what it means for them, or they might just think of it as like a really shitty thing that happened one day.
Right. Yeah. As part of the Teach Us Consent movement, you talk about how sexual violence occurs on a spectrum, and it's not just penetrative intercourse that counts as sexual violence, and it's all a big deal. You know, but like the rape culture, or like the cultural narrative is like, it's not a big deal unless it's physically violent with a weapon, penetrative intercourse, and the other stuff doesn't count. But I think, right, that's like a big part of the point is like, no, it all counts and it's all a big deal. And you know, I also like, you talk about how we currently classify sexual violence as occurring depending on whether a victim said yes or no, right? Like was it sexual violence? Did she say yes? Did she say no? Or he? And you talk about how you think the classification should really revolve around the perpetrator's intent. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a hard thing to talk about because that chapter is very intricate, but I think it is important. Essentially, what I'm saying is that we know that women may change their responses to sexual situations depending on their past histories. So, for example, often lots of women say they just said yes to just make it stop, or they say yes because past experience has taught them that it might not be safe to say no. And the I'm just going to speak in a binary here, but the hypothetical boy in this situation doesn't know this thought process that's going on. And also, rape can't happen if the victim consents. So the question is, what the victim does shouldn't really matter, because if they say yes, but whatever they said, it was going to happen anyway, then we should be looking at how perpetrators are responding to situations and how they're responding to rejection and how okay they are with it. And I think that that is an important flip, particularly looking at rates of hypersexuality that are experienced by people who are subjected to sexual violence or whose sexual assault was an early experience for them. And again, the narrative so many women give that like they're just trying to avoid conflict.
Right. So we should be focusing on, if you are the perpetrator and your intent is to force sex no matter what, that's rape. That could potentially be rape. Whereas if your intention is to make sure you get an affirmative and enthusiastic yes, that's what you mean by like the perpetrator's intent is the more important thing, rather than whether the victim says yes or no.
Yes.
Yeah.
You summarized it better than I did.
Well, I want to talk about the hypersexuality. So I'm developing a new podcast for people to share their stories of speaking up and speaking out. And my first guest was Jules Bindi, and she was Harvey Weinstein's massage therapist. Oh, wow. And of course, he sexually assaulted her. Yes. And one of the things she talks about, like very tearfully talks about, is struggling with the fact that she continued to have contact with him after he assaulted her the first time, and then he went on to assault her again. And even to this day, all these years later, she struggles with knowing that. She said to me, like, why do we go back? Why did I go back? But we know that's a very common occurrence. And I mean, it's fawning, right? And so that tendency to engage in fawning in response to a sexual assault, as well as that tendency to become hypersexual following an assault, these are things that in court cases, the defense of the perpetrator will use as proof, that this couldn't have possibly been rape, because if you were raped, why did you keep seeing this person? Or why did you or it's just because, you're a slut because look how much sex you've been having. When in reality, this is actually proof that a person is traumatized. These are responses to trauma. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So fawning was another thing that when I came across in my research, I was just kind of like, because it just felt like it gave a word to so many accounts of sexual assault that I had read and published and spoken to people about, where they kind of describe a moment of suddenly realizing they're unsafe, so going along with it anyway. And fawning is being over nice in a situation in order to survive an ordeal. I know that this audience, there's lots of psychologists on it. They probably heard about this.
But you know what? We've never done an episode on fawning yet. We have one coming up in the future for exactly this reason. So we haven't talked much about it.
It is so important. And I think traditionally my understanding is that it kind of sat within the body of research around, kids who grew up in abusive households and PTSD, and the fact that on a smaller scale, if we're just using the term people pleasers, that's kind of a hot term at the moment, and people who lower their boundaries for other people. But yeah, fawning, I think, is something that when it's described to you, everyone can think of an instance where it's happened. Like, someone screaming at you on the street because maybe they're not very mentally stable, and you just smile and keep your head down and keep walking straight because you're trying to de-escalate the situation. And again, that's like a small specific example. But what's interesting about fawning is that it is a highly gendered stress response, because we all know about fight and flight mode, obviously. But fight and flight mode are also highly gendered stress responses. They're much more likely for men to engage in those responses, because physically running away or physically fighting back is, again, I'm going to speak stereotypically, we're talking about a male perpetrator and a female victim. It's extremely illogical for a woman to try to physically fight back when, generally speaking, the man will probably be larger and stronger and faster. And so they got to like the 90s, and then they were like, we've never actually done any studies on women about the way that they respond to stressful situations. And when they did that, they found that freeze and fawn were much more common responses for women to do. And fawning actually used to be called tend and befriend, and the idea that a woman would have to befriend a perpetrator or a potential perpetrator while tending to her offspring and her baby in order to keep it safe for survival. And you can fawn over a long period of time, particularly if someone is in a position of power or is in your social life or social setting. And it's looking like appeasing that perpetrator. It's looking like doing what they want to do without enthusiasm, because again, this is why enthusiastic consent is so important. But for example, a situation that came up so many times when I read 7,000 testimonies of sexual assault was someone would describe something like, he locked the door behind me. And that like motion of a lock to be like, I am suddenly unsafe. I am in a room where I'm locked in a room with a man. And because of that, again, I'm just going to give him a blowjob because that's much easier than what could potentially happen if I try to escape this room or if I don't do anything. And I want to preface this by saying that fawning is a really important stress response. It is a really important survivor response. And there is a reason that it is so frequently done. It's because it works. And the people who fawn have a lot of self-blame and self-doubt. But your body did what it had to do in that situation in order to survive. And that is a very good and very important thing. But the kind of insidious thing about fawning, it is slightly self-fulfilling in that you're anticipating a conflict or anticipating violence. Therefore, you succumb to what the perpetrator wants before they even inflict that violence. And with the blueberry analogy, I describe it in the book. It's like you take the antidote before you know you've eaten the poisonous one. If someone shoves 5 blueberries down your face and you don't know which one you've eaten, you're obviously going to take the antidote to the poison. And fawning is that antidote. And it is very common. And again, it is highly gendered. And if we're zooming out again and we're thinking fawning, which can also be highly socialized, and women are socialized to appease others at the expense of their boundaries. And then you have entitled opportunists. And again, that is also highly socialized, the entitlement that comes. And you have this mismatch where you have someone who has very high empathy, low boundaries, and a tendency to people please with someone who has, high levels of entitlement, is used to instant sexual gratification and wants something off that person. And they're both 16 years old and they're in a room together. Well, it's a recipe for fucking disaster.
Right. Thank you so much for explaining that. I think that is not well understood. I think these terms are kind of newer in the lexicon. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand and to put a dent in rape culture too. You know how some people have that superpower of being the greatest gift givers? Well, unfortunately, I am not one of them. Fortunately, though, I discovered Aura frames, and they are the best gift for just about anyone on your list. Aura is a digital picture frame that holds thousands of photos, is incredibly easy to set up, and can be accessed by multiple people from anywhere. So if you are gift-giving challenged like me, Aura is here to the rescue. For a limited time, save on this perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver matte frames, named #1 by Wirecutter by using promo code POTC at checkout. That's auraframes.com, promo code POTC. This deal is exclusive to listeners and frames sell out fast, so order yours now and get it in time for the holidays. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. I don't know about you, but I usually love a good spreadsheet. Unfortunately, they just don't cut it anymore when it comes to managing and organizing our family finances, especially this time of year when things get a little more complicated during the holiday season. That's why I was thrilled to discover Monarch. Monarch does the heavy lifting, linking all your accounts in minutes and even sending alerts when it notices a large or unusual expense. So if you want to keep your finances under control this holiday season, you need to be using Monarch. Rated Wall Street Journal's best budgeting app of 2025, Monarch is the all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean interface on your laptop or your phone. And right now, just for our listeners, Monarch is offering 50% off your first year. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK. So these days, consent, of course, no longer applies only to in-person interactions, but online too. And now we're hearing about, nudes and sexts and boys often sharing these materials without permission. And similarly, we talked a little bit earlier about the problem with pornography. And I love this quote. You say, learning to have sex from watching porn is like learning to drive by watching Formula One. I thought that was so brilliant. But, you say that like just telling kids don't send sex or don't look at porn is obviously not going to work. So do you have some suggestions for what parents should do instead, or what adults in youth lives maybe can do or say instead that could start to have an impact on cutting this down?
I think conversations are really important for parents to have with young people. And I think it's really, really scary because when you look at the statistics, you think, oh, I don't know them off the top of my head, but a significant amount of 13-year-old kids have watched pornography, most of them by accident the first time. And you think like, oh, not my kid. But if not your kid, then the kid that they're sitting next to on the school bus on the way home, or, their older sibling or their really close friend at the sleepover, or unfortunately this content gets around and you kind of need to assume that it's something that your kid is going to access. And it's, again, really important to remember that most of the time it is accessed. The first time it's accessed accidentally or without them wanting to access it, someone shows it to them, or it comes up as a pop-up on a gaming website or whatever it is. So having conversations from younger than you think you need to have. I hear a lot of parents say things to me like, oh, not my kid. Like, they're not interested in girls yet. They're not interested in boys yet. Like, they're not there. And I'm like, oh, no, it happens so much before they're there. Unfortunately, it's really jarring. But again, you're literally looking at like a child and thinking they may come across this content. So what's so important is for them to know that there isn't shame in that. And if they do come across that content, that they could come to you for help to debrief and decompress from that situation, because it can be extremely jarring for a young person, and that it can very quickly spiral into like curiosity and shame if there is no outlet for them to talk to a trusted adult in their life about it. So, saying things like, if you ever see something on the internet that you're confused about or that you don't like or that makes you feel really uncomfortable, we can have a chat about it. Or like, is there anything you've seen on the internet like this? Or, what sort of thing comes up on your social feed? Or maybe you're watching a rom-com together and there's a kissing scene, and that's an opportunity to say, it's okay, you're 13 years old, you can watch this scene, but there's some things that you shouldn't be watching. And, if you ever do come across that, we can talk about that. Or if you have any questions, I'd rather you speak to me about it than go down a hole on the internet about it. So I think there are ways to just bridge the shame gap and get rid of the taboo. And I think that is so, so important. And I think it's really important to hear from young people what they're experiencing in real time, because again, not for the shock value, but like it is scary and shocking working with young people and hearing about the things that are common for them at different ages. Because even for me, I'm still quite young. I'm only 27 years old. And, I grew up with smartphones. Everyone had an iPhone, blah, 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 but only from the age of 15 upwards. And now there's kids with iPhones from 11 upwards.
Yeah.
And all the things that were happening to us when we were 15, 16 are happening 10 times the scale now with 11-year-olds.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing, like taking intimate photos, image sharing. And again, the shame is kind of what keeps that and allows that to happen, because a lot of young people, they would rather their whole year group see that 10 times over than they would their parent know about it once. Mm-hmm. And trying to bridge that, break that shame, keep young people safe, and thinking about how can we ensure that we're not trying to, obviously abstinence doesn't work. And unfortunately, it's the same for online interactions. But then it's really important to have conversations about consent and the difference between a 17-year-old sending an intimate photo to their 17-year-old partner in a consenting, loving relationship, and the difference between that photo getting into the hands of an adult or someone who shouldn't have it, and how different and how much more grave that can be. So it's hard because they're children, but unfortunately, not unfortunately, but children have sexualities, and we need to confront that head on for their safety.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, they're definitely uncomfortable conversations, but I've been stunned at some of the things my kids have talked about. And I'm grateful that they talk about it openly in front of me. And I will never shut that down for exactly the reasons you say. But like terms and words and things they know that I didn't know until I was probably a junior or senior in high school. And that they're 11 and 13 and like joking with each other about, like the term 69. I'm like, I had no idea what that meant when I was their age. I mean, to be honest, I don't know if they know what it means. They know that it's something taboo.
Yeah.
But I've said, do you know what that means? And they say yes, but then I haven't made them prove it because then I don't want to have to tell them what it means. But I keep thinking like, well, is that the wrong thing? Maybe I should have that open conversation with them if I'm trying to kind of show that we can talk about anything and it's not taboo. But that's just one example of like a really tricky place of like, what's the right call as a mom? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And to hear from them as well, being like, oh, like what's going on in the year group? And if they feel comfortable to be like, oh, there's like a big scandal at school because this person said to do to that person and they posted it in this group chat. It's really important to know about that and then to talk about that and use that as an opportunity to have conversations with them in ways that are really relevant to them and where they're at. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how young you need to start because often I'll go in and speak at a school and I'll be speaking to 15, 16-year-olds and they'll be like, we've outgrown that. Like, we don't do that. Like, that's so lame. That's so 2 years ago that we would send naked photos of each other. And I'm sitting there being like, oh my God.
I know. You're feeling like the old lady at only 27 because they're doing things so young. Well, I'm looking at the clock. I know we're getting to the end of our time here, but we've been talking about how sexual assault occurs when entitlement outweighs empathy. And you talk about in the book how violence against women is the most common human rights violation in the world, right? In the US, we have a president and 2 Supreme Court justices, which is 40% of the male justices, by the way, who have had credible sexual assault allegations brought against them. And yet they were still able to achieve some of the most powerful positions in the country, if not the world. And we see what this teaches boys about what they're entitled to, the lack of consequences that follow. And it teaches girls that they and their bodies are there for the taking. So, like, when this is the world that we're currently living in, like, what hope do we have? How do we make people care? How do we make men see women as human? How do we raise the empathy and reduce the entitlement? Like, is it even possible?
It is possible. Do you know why it's possible? Because we do it really well in girls. We are really good at socializing empathy into girls.
Yeah, good point.
And it's really just these invisible, arbitrary gendered expectations of boys can't cry and they have to be stoic and they have to be this and that and they're going to be boisterous and they're going to just break things and we're just going to allow it and whatever. That allows us to do that. Meanwhile, we're saying, again, women have to be catering the emotions of everyone around them at all times, and they have to suffer discomfort to make sure that everyone feels calm and safe and happy. And, all the horrible narratives we hear about, like, marriage and, like, the kind of, like, roles that get played out in them and the whole ball and chain and all that stuff plays into a world where we have an empathy gap. And I think that if our sole focus was to raise the next generation of boys to be just as empathetic as our girls, which might require challenging some pre-notions about, again, like what a boy should do or how they should be or how they should act. But if you really boil it down at the end of the day, just think we're trying to raise healthier, happier, more emotionally in touch and intelligent and kind young boys.
Yeah.
Then it sounds pretty good.
It does. And consent education everywhere.
And consent education everywhere. But consent education doesn't work unless we've got that empathy piece.
Right.
If someone doesn't care about upsetting someone or violating their boundaries, then they're not going to care.
That's a good point. It's necessary, but not sufficient.
It's necessary but not sufficient, yes. And then again, the only other option then is if they say accountability for people who do those things. But as you just said, we have Supreme Court justices and presidents with very legitimate backed allegations against them. So when that's the case, then we've really, unfortunately, if the criminal system's not working, the accountability system's not working, then we
And
need
even
to
the
go-
social consequences aren't working.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the empathy needs to be beyond an individual young person's sphere. Because again, we're really good at, like, young boys are really good at having empathy for their sisters and maybe for their best friend and for their mom. And for their auntie and blah, 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 blah. And they don't like it when they hear the statistics, and they don't like it when their mom tells them that they're one of the statistics. Like, they don't like to hear those things. That's not nice for them. We need to socialize empathy beyond immediate relation to you. And, you know, that will help so many things, not just sexual violence. It will help with bullying. It will help with racism. It will help with so many societal values, because that's true empathy. If you don't have to connect yourself to it to feel that person deserves
respect,
full and happy respect and an existence as a human.
Yes. Brilliant. Well, that is a perfect place for us to end. Chanel, thank you so much. This was such a great and important conversation. If people want to find you, learn more about you, where can they go?
On Instagram, my Instagram's Chanel C. My company Instagram is Teach Us Consent, which has amazing resources for young people. I definitely recommend checking those out. My website, my company's website, teachusconsent.com, has heaps of resources for young people, an incredible podcast series if you like podcasts, if you're listening to this, that you can play with your young person in the car or just hand it over to them, whatever you feel, or if you want to learn more about the intricacies of this topic. And my book is called Consent Laid Bare, so please check that out. Also a great resource for teens.
It is. I was just going to say the same thing. It's a great book, and it's written at a level that adults and tweens and teens alike could really, really benefit from it. Highly recommend it.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Thanks for listening to my episode with Chanel about consent. I'm here with Debbie for our co-host post. Debbie, what were your thoughts about this episode?
I am so glad that you did this episode, Jill. This is so important. And as a listener, I thought I had a pretty good grasp on consent before I listened. And I learned so much, and just grateful, because I think that having conversations like these do move the needle, and they help people think about concepts like consent in a different way. And it's really important. And listening, I went through a little bit of an emotional journey with it. There were a lot of intense things that you talked about, important things. And I think given the times that we're living in and the cultural element of all of this, it's a little discouraging sometimes, because even though these types of conversations move the needle and we're having more of them, and like my kids are way better educated on consent than I was at their age, there's a backlash. And I get very upset about that sometimes. And backlashes happen, and we're in one, and it's very sad to me. But then you ended on a note of hope. So thank you for bringing this to our listeners and to me.
Yeah, I was so glad that they pitched us. They found us, and I thought, oh gosh, yeah, we've never done an episode like this at all. And it is such an important topic. And there were quite a few meaningful insights, I felt like. I mean, especially this whole idea that with the entitled opportunist rapists, that the empathy is low and the entitlement is high. And after I wrapped up this interview, I was thinking about it for quite a long time. And I thought, that actually shows up in a lot of different places, like trolls, for example, right? That's a high entitlement and a low empathy. And I thought about a lot of the places where we see problematic behavior, like just the stuff that my kids accidentally happen upon on YouTube, and, just like these influencers or the Andrew Tates of the world, where a lot of that filth that's out there, or whether it's racism, sexism, like just so many things, homophobia, where it feels like so much of that is related to a high sense of entitlement and a low sense of empathy.
Yeah, I love that concept. And that's where I get disturbed, when you see these examples in the world. And I sometimes read articles about the incel movement. I don't know how much you know about that, Jill, but, it's men, and they are very angry because they think that women owe them certain things, sex or dating or relationships, and they're very angry about this and very public about their opinions about this. And I get so disturbed for women everywhere and for my daughters.
For listeners who don't know what incel stands for, is involuntarily celibate. So
Yeah.
they're not having sex, but they want to be. And so that's where that, like, I feel entitled to be having sex with women and it's their fault. I mean, it's just very misogynistic when you dig into these incel places.
Yes, it's so misogynistic. And I was thinking about the empathy part of that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, well, if that's your mentality, then you're not thinking of the perspective of someone else and you don't have empathy. It's all about you and your needs and the world owes you this. And no wonder you don't have the partner or girlfriend that you want. Maybe you should start with that and then you'll be more appealing as a partner. I mean, I don't think they care what I think. And so probably no one will take this advice from me, but why don't you try to hone your empathy a little bit? And then this won't be the problem that you're dealing with.
Well, and that's essentially what Chanel was suggesting is that, like, when I asked her at the very end, like, what hope do we even have? It was basically teaching people empathy, and empathy can be taught. And, I guess maybe for us, for our listeners, that can start at home with our own kids, and hope that has an impact.
Yeah, because I think sometimes the message is like, well, get consent so you don't get in trouble.
Right.
And it's like, no, that's not what it's about. It's about teaching consent and respect and empathy.
Yes, because you care about your partner's experience, because you're thinking about how it would feel to be him or her if they were in a situation where they were not enthusiastically consenting. Yeah, that's a really good point. You're right. It's like, I have to cross this T, dot this I, so I don't get in trouble. It's like a CYA when really it should be because you genuinely care about somebody else's experience. Yeah, it's a great point. Well, guys, thanks so much for listening. We hope that this was helpful and share it with your friends. See you next time. Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.